Hello, my name is Michelle Morrison, and the myth I will be talking about today is the autism epidemic. Here I have shown why people believe the myth and their evidence behind it. The autism epidemic myth came about when the public became more aware in the increase of children with autism. People began jumping to conclusions, causing a panic in parents about the chances of their children getting autism. The statistics shown in the graph below is what started the main concern. And at the same time of the epidemic, the requirement for the number of vaccines given was increased, which people used to link to the outbreak of increase in autism in their children. The public claimed the vaccines as an environmental factor to autism, and many refused to let their children get vaccines in fear that would give their children autism. The only true evidence the myth believers had were the statistics of the rise in number of children recorded with autism, but that does not tell you the reason why the influx happened. These are the responses of the people I interviewed when I asked if they believed in the autism epidemic, and their reasoning and evidence behind their answer. For subject 1, they did not believe in the autism epidemic. Instead, they said it would not make sense since generations and generations of people have to have autism for kids nowadays to have autism, because genetics don't alter from one generation and just pop up. They have to have it from families and parents before them. So it is less likely that autism suddenly popped up in their children. More likely the autism gene was always there, but just not recognized. For subject 2, they said they did not believe in the autism epidemic either. Instead, they said their evidence was, starting in the 60s, that people began to use drugs more likely and more heavily, which could affect the child's development. Because the statistics show that the number of children with birth defects were higher when born from parents who use or abuse drugs. And her claim was that if drugs affect adults that negatively, how do you think it would affect an unborn child in the mother's fetus? And her other point was that environmental factors such as chemicals in the food, air, and water, and pollution in our earth can have an effect on how our children develop later on in life. Subject 3 also did not believe in the myth. They claimed that instead that we just recognize autism more, because her evidence behind that was that psychology was not founded until 1879, which makes it a young field compared to other sciences. This would in turn give psychology less time and opportunity to capture and understand all psychological conditions that people face, which includes autism. That most likely is why they couldn't recognize autism back in the 60s, because they didn't know exactly what it was and how they could diagnose it. But now today we have better understanding of the condition, and we are able to pick out the children that are diagnosed with autism and or correct children that were mistakenly diagnosed with the wrong condition. Now all 3 of these I have labeled as empirical data because they were all scientifically proven or historically proven. The evidence against the myth, oddly enough, is the same evidence myth believers use to prove their point, which is the statistics of the increase of children with autism. The only difference is the reasoning behind the numbers. And here we have that now that we have a better understanding and knowledge of the autism epidemic, we have a more broadened criteria used to diagnose children with autism. In the past, a child had to meet 6 out of 6 of the criteria to be diagnosed with autism, which made the scope for autism very narrow and hard to diagnose. Now the requirements to be diagnosed with autism are to meet 8 out of the 16 advanced criteria, which give more children the ability to fit the definition of autism. The idea behind this is also that the harder the scientists looked and researched for autism, the more likely they were able to find more cases. And the second point we were able to find was that there was a change in diagnosis for children with autism, because this seemed to cause a diagnostic substitution, which is changing previous diagnoses to the correct diagnosis. That's because back then they didn't understand how to define autism, so most of the time kids were either labeled as mental retardation or as a social outcast, but truly they were suffering from autism. So now we're able to go back and re-diagnose these children with autism instead of what their previous diagnosis was, which then changes the number of children. As well, this new diagnosis criteria helps us fit more children into the definition of autism. These number of children with autism have always been here, but they were just never recognized. Here, with our new improved diagnosis, I have shown you the requirements and the severity that psychologists use to define children with autism. So now, a couple other requirements. These are not all of them, but the main factors. First, we have trouble with social communication and interaction. So this can be having trouble having good conversations, not having good eye contact, and may cross social boundaries with other people, making the situation uncomfortable. And sometimes they can take things too literally, like not understanding sarcasm. And this is where the social and interaction communications kind of make the line for where autism lies and where maybe, say, a social outcast would lie, is these factors. Now, the second one is the nonverbal communication, which is our body language. So sometimes children with autism really have trouble distinguishing facial expressions such as, anger or annoyance. They won't understand that most of the time. And they have trouble reading body language, like if somebody's uncomfortable and they try to scooch away or they're pulling themselves in. They're not going to understand that the way most people understand that, which is what the trouble they have with being social with other people. The third one is their trouble with relationships. They tend to not be able to understand how to make a relationship or how to keep one, such as friendships or relationships with boyfriends and girlfriends. They don't know how to understand them and how they work or process, so they tend to not do very well with relationships. Now, severity, I guess that determines how, because there's different levels of autism, so the severity would then define which type of autism or how bad of autism condition they have. So the first one is the repetitive motor movements and speech, which could be rocking or hand gestures and repeating the same conversations and words over and over, which wouldn't make sense to us, but it's something they do without thinking. They can't help it. So their hand gestures, or they'll say the same word over and over without even having a reason to. Now, the second one is the insistence on sameness and routines. So they were very big on schedules and having everything the same each day, having their routine. And when this is disrupted, they tend to get very highly upset. Or when something goes out of order, then they notice that, and it tends to upset them more than it would the average person. The third one is the intensity of and fixation of an unusual object. This could be more of an interest, you could say, interest in things other people wouldn't even notice. That could be collecting shiny things, from seeing a penny in the parking lot to a spring in the gym. They'll pick it up and they tend to collect things. Or it would be scraps of paper. They'll just collect little things that most people would think were insignificant. And of course, being hyperactive, that kind of speaks for itself. That would be they had a lot of energy, always needed to be doing something. And so all of these things kind of fit in the norm of children that have autism, which helps people kind of register children with autism and how to diagnose them with it. Here I have stated the myth, which is the sudden nationwide increase in the number of children with autism, which is not correct in the sense that people believe it came from the wrong things such as vaccines and it just popping out of the blue. Now the correct thing they should say instead is that there has been advances in the knowledge and understanding of autism condition, and this has allowed us to correctly diagnose children with autism or re-diagnose children that were never correctly diagnosed in the first place. This would be more true to what is actually happening in the sudden increase in the number of children with autism. Lastly, I have my resources where I gained my information from. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks and gig'em.